Well, thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, to the American Library for giving me the opportunity to speak about the jeweler, jewelry historian, art collector, bibliophile, mayor, bicycle enthusiast, Parisian man about town, Henri Vever, who is the subject of my forthcoming book, which is an edition of Henri Vever's diaries for 1898, which is forthcoming in late January with Armand Collin, and you can purchase it on Amazon or certainly in bookstores around Paris. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the numerous people here, members of the Vever family and their extended circle, curators, archivists, librarians, art dealers, gallery owners, editors, colleagues, who were really instrumental in helping me bring this project to fruition. So I'm really excited to be able to thank all of these people publicly, and thanks to many of them for being here tonight as well. So Grant provided me with the perfect introduction already, which is to say that outside of the Vever family and perhaps specialists in jewelry history and in the history of art, as I have found in my 8 to 10 years of research on Henri Vever, he is really very little known, if known at all, both in France and in the United States. You may well have heard, like Grant Rosenberg, of René Lalique, whom Vever greatly admired, whom he considered a genius, whom he wrote about extensively in his diaries, and who in fact at one point early in his career designed pieces for the Maison Vever. Yet you may never have heard of Henri Vever. Similarly, you may well know some famous collectors of Asian art of the late 19th century, including, for example, Émile Guimet, who has given his name to a museum in Paris, or Charles Lang Freer, the great American collector of the late 19th century, who gave his name to the Freer Gallery of Art at the Smithsonian Institution, which holds the Vever papers. But again, you may not have heard of Henri Vever in this context. Nevertheless, Henri Vever's collection of Japanese prints and art objects, as well as his equally famous collection of illustrated manuscripts of Persia, the Islamic world, of the Mughal dynasty, were so significant and so important that when they were acquired by Henri Vever's grandson, François Motin, by the Smithsonian Institution in 1988, they were considered major acquisitions to this museum. So as I've already begun to suggest, I hope that with the publication of this diary, with the publication of some of these papers and my ongoing work on them, that Henri Vever will come to be more widely and better known as a very important figure in the cultural and artistic milieu of his time. And so that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about tonight. I'd like to say a few words about how I came upon these diaries. This is, scholars always like to talk about the research end of things. And then I'll talk about the diaries themselves and what I find fascinating about them and what I think they can tell us about the world, about Henri Vever and the world that he lived in. So just a few words about how I came upon the diaries. I came upon them when I was doing research for my previous book, which, as mentioned, is a study of French book collectors, bibliophiles, designers of beautiful books in the late 19th century. I knew that Henri Vever was an important bibliophile, not only a collector, but also a designer and creator of beautiful books. And so I went to the Freer and Sackler galleries at the Smithsonian to look at his papers, to see what I could find out about him as a book lover. The existence of the papers is known. There is a finding aid online. But strangely, the private papers are very little used, if at all. And they've certainly not been published until this point in any significant fashion. They were given along with this stupendous collection of Japanese art and Islamic arts of the book. And we're just sort of sitting there in a box with people not really using them. So just very briefly, to tell you what this archive contains, it contains the 4 main diaries that I've been working on. You see a page from the 1898 diary on the left. So these are diaries that Henri Vever wrote between 1898 and 1901, as you can see, in very plain notebooks, in a very clear hand, in pen. Daily. There's hardly a day when he doesn't write in his diaries, which makes a transcription of about 800 pages for the years 1898 to 1901. There's also a diary from 1878, a single year, so 20 years earlier, that recounts in large part the World's Fair of that year, the Exposition Universelle of 1878. And also Henri Vever's Vie de Garçon as an unmarried bachelor in fin-de-siècle Paris, going to the opera and dating the ballerinas from the opera. And it's a very interesting document as well. There's also what you see on the right, a travel journal, which is about this big, written in pencil, which I've managed to transcribe, of a very interesting trip that Vever and his wife took in 1891 in the context of a Franco-Russian trade exhibit of 1891 in the context of the Franco-Russian alliance. And as a result of this trip, Vever and his wife traveled from Paris to Samarkand. So 3,500 kilometers along the Silk Road by boat, bicycle, horse, train, you name it. And these are just 2 of the photos in the photo album also that's part of this collection of Vever and his wife in Tiflis in what's now Georgia today, and Vever on the left in probably a bazaar in Bukhara or Astrakhan, covered with tapestries and brocade and the many objects of Central Asia, of Islamic culture of Central Asia, that he would start to collect with very, very great passion. So this is part of the collection as well. The Vever papers also contain purchase registers of Vever's art purchases between 1894 and 1917. And for anyone who's interested in the art market, these are very interesting documents because it shows you exactly what he spent on Japanese art, on engravings, on rare books, and it shows you all the dealers that he dealt with and the prices he paid. And it's a very, very interesting document. And that's online. Anyone who is interested in it can consult it online. The archive contains, finally, some paintings by Vever, a family photograph album, and some sundry objects, including this very pretty communion card from the first communion of his daughter Marguerite of 1894. And this is a photograph of Marguerite in her first communion dress. So as I read these diaries then, just to finish about this archive, which I went to consult for a project on bibliophilia, I became completely engrossed in the world of this very creative, very talented, very interesting man. And I couldn't stop reading the diaries. And every day when I was at the Smithsonian, the guards would have to come and drag me out at the end of the day, and then I would come back at 9 o'clock in the morning and start reading again because I wanted to time travel back to the end of the 19th century and be plunged into this world, this fascinating world. And this eventually led to my decision to publish the diaries, as I have for 1898, in their entirety. It's not an abridged version. You have the entire diary in the original French, with a long introduction and with many, many notes so you can understand a bit about people that are mentioned, places in the diary. So I decided to do this instead of, for example, writing a monograph or a biography, which I might have done as well, and which perhaps someone will do now. This would be, Vever would be a wonderful subject for a biography. Let me now turn to the diaries and tell you that what I really find so compelling is the many different identities that Vever had. This was a man who was involved in many different worlds, in very different milieux, and his different identities intersect and overlap in very interesting ways that I think really help determine his influence. Jewelry making is one of them. Tonight I'm actually going to talk about Vever as a jeweler at the end of my remarks, because I really feel that all of his activities were of a piece, and I hope to give you some sense of how these different activities enmeshed. The first of these identities is of Henri Vever as a native of the city of Metz in Lorraine, where he was born in 1854 into a family of jewelers and goldsmiths dating back several generations in a city that was very renowned for this trade. When Vever was 16 years old in 1870, as you may know, France went to war with Prussia. Prussia had imperial ambitions and wished to annex territories of Germanic language and culture, including Alsace-Lorraine. This was a very traumatic event for Henri Vever. His father, Ernest, who was a jeweler himself, a great patriot, leapt to the charge of a company of francs-tireurs, basically leading commando operations in the city of Metz. Henri Vever was too young to participate in the Franco-Prussian War. He was only 16 years old at the time, something that he would very much regret, as he writes about in his journals. Unlike his older brother Paul, who would soon become his business partner, who did fight during the Franco-Prussian War, or at least helped out his father during the siege of Metz. The Franco-Prussian War and the memory of l'année terrible is a main theme in these diaries. It resurfaces like a trauma every year when Vever talks about an anniversary mass for the victims of the war dead of Metz that they celebrate in a chapel in the Rue de Sèvres. He writes flashbacks of traumatic memories of carriages going by in Metz with dead and dying, of blood running through the streets of Metz, and really it is experienced as a trauma. It also comes through in the diaries as a forward look to la revanche, to revenge against Germany, ever present in Vever's spirit that he is very focused on, and interestingly colors many of his political views, colors, as we learn in the diaries, his views about colonialism, about the Dreyfus Affair, about France's place in the world, and much else. So this is a very important theme, and its memory too will eventually, now I'm looking forward to 1918, but the memory of 1870 will eventually be present in some of his pieces, including in 1918 a sword handle that he designed for Maréchal Foch in 1918 when the Allies were victorious and when Alsace-Lorraine was re-annexed, became French again. And the Maison Vever, and I should mention that Foch had been a schoolmate of Vever in Metz. And the Maison Vever was asked to design a sword handle with allegorical figures of Alsace-Lorraine on it. So all this to say that the memory of 1870 is very present. Vever also talks about the history of his family and the siege of Metz in this book, and I'll just mention it here because Vever was also a very prominent jewelry historian. This is Vever's magisterial 3-volume history of French jewelry in the 19th century, La bijouterie française au 19e siècle, which in addition to being a history of French jewelry, as you see here, is also a history. It contains the history of many French jewelry houses. It contains some very interesting sociological commentary about jewelry and fashion history. And again, as mentioned, it contains a long history of the Vever family, including their experience of the siege of Metz. And so as a result of the siege and France's defeat in 1870, and Alsace-Lorraine being annexed to Germany, the Vever family opts for French nationality instead of becoming German. They decide to leave Metz and forego their home, but maintain French nationality. But not without, as we learn from the diaries, first going to the cemetery in Metz and digging up the coffins of the ancestors. And as Vever will write in his diary, nous n'avons pas voulu les laisser aux mains des Prussiens. So he writes in his diary, they go to the cemetery, they dig up the coffins, and they physically transport the ancestors to Luxembourg and then eventually to Paris. They make it to Paris in 1870. And Ernest Vever buys out the jewelry business of another jeweler named Beaugrand, who had died during the siege of Paris in 1870-71. And this business is at 19 Rue de la Paix, where the Maison Vever will have its store and the family will live as well. So in other words, the family settles in what at the end of the 19th century is the epicenter of French luxury commerce. So in the last decades of the 19th century, the Rue de la Paix is where you find the couturier Frederick Worth, you find furriers, you find éventaillistes, you find very chic hotels, and you find many jewelry companies that had been there much longer than the Maison Vever, like Mellerio, like Aucoq, like Fontana Frères, and also like Boucheron, which was and is in the Place Vendôme, close by to the Rue de la Paix. So the Maison Vever is kind of the new kid on the block, much newer than some of these other firms, but is going to become part of this world of luxury commerce that develops at the end of the 19th century with a clientele that is increasingly bourgeois and aristocratic and increasingly international as well, the closer we get to the 1900 World's Fair. So at this point, Vever is a young man in his 20s, a kind of young man about town. And he is going to take classes at the École des Beaux-Arts in the studio of Jérôme. And a quote from his diary. I have quotes in English and French, and you can read whichever one you want. I won't read all of them. But it's very clear in his diary that he had a vocation as a painter, that he wanted to be a painter, and that he would very dutifully follow his brother into the family jewelry business. He's also going to the École des Beaux-Arts at this time as well. And as mentioned, shortly after the World's Fair of 1878, and you see the Maison Vever display here and the type of jewelry that they were producing. Shortly after this exposition, Ernest Vever retires and hands over the jewelry business to his two sons. About this time, 1881, Vever marries, and he marries this woman, Jeanne Montier, who has roots in the Vexin Normand and in Pontoise. I'm not entirely sure how they met. My hunch is that they may have met through a cousin of Jeanne Montier named Maurice Montier, who was the French commissioner to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And Vever is going to become more and more involved in this world of World's Fairs. There's a whole cadre of men who are mounting the World's Fairs at the end of the century. In any event, Vever marries, and it's very clear from the diaries that this is not a happy marriage. Vever is very dissatisfied in his marriage. He's very unfulfilled in his marriage. He refers to his wife as an iceberg, as l'iceberg. And he writes about this at length. He contemplates straying from his marriage. But at least if we are to believe him in the 4 years of writing, he does not, in part because of religious morality. He's fairly observant and writes in his diary that he wants to have the reward of ma conscience intacte. So he makes the decision not to stray from his marriage. He also contemplates divorce. It's very clear from the diaries. Divorce had been legalized again in France in 1884. And several people in Vever's family and entourage were divorcing, and he gave very serious thought to this as well, but did not because of his daughter Marguerite, here with her dog Pouf. Vever's other dog was named Cyrano, a very good name for the fin-de-siècle. However, from the perspective of the marital strategies that were of paramount importance to the bourgeoisie during this era as a way of helping them accrue economic, social, and cultural capital, this was a very successful marriage. Jeanne was a woman of some wealth who brought to the marriage a domaine in the Vexin Normand, the Domaine de Noyer, which was an 18th century chateau that had once belonged to Napoleon's finance minister. From her mother, she had inherited this property. Excuse me. And consequently, Vever is actually going to become the mayor of Noyers. And this is yet another identity. He becomes a Republican notable. He becomes a mayor of this tiny little town with 250 inhabitants, but becomes a very proud Republican mayor who loves to put on his sautoir or his écharpe, as you see here, and preside Bastille Day celebrations and preside distribution des prix and preside elections. And this becomes a point of much pride for him. And he, as he writes about in the 1900 diary, he attends the famous mayor's banquet, the Banquet des Maires, during the 1900 World's Fair, which is a stupendous mega event to which 22,000 French mayors were invited and attended. So Vever was one of these 22,000 who put on their sautoir and went to have lunch in the Tuileries. So about Noyers, and here you see the main street, the Grande Rue of Noyers, this commune about 50 miles from Paris. Vever writes a tremendous amount in his diaries about Noyers and about the contrast between Paris and the proche campagne. And very interesting, he writes about the Paris and the proche campagne that at once are becoming closer, that in many ways are becoming closer during this period through the extension of railway networks into this part of the countryside, and also because of the telephone. He can now telephone to the Rue de la Paix and inquire about his business affairs. But at the same time, he really remarks on a kind of cultural divide and gouffre culturel, as you see here. And it's very interesting to read him on Noyers. I'd say his tone is both affectionate and somewhat snobby, somewhat bemused. He writes, for example, about what he calls the antediluvian clothing of the people, the antediluvian hats of the people in Noyers. He complains about the little orchestra, the fanfare that plays on Bastille Day, and how horribly off-key they are, where he has to cover his ears. So it's a very interesting view into attitudes of a Parisian towards the countryside and how the relationship between Paris and the countryside was changing during this period. So again, thanks to Jean Vever, Jean Montier, Henri Vever becomes a propriétaire, not only of a domain in Normandy, but also a property in Paris. She also brings several buildings to the marriage. The family owns a building in the Rue Vignon, near the Grand Boulevard, and also owns a building in the Rue Julien Lacroix in Belleville, so in a very popular neighborhood during this period. So we learn all about what it is like to be a landlord, or rather, as Vever writes, plutôt époux d'une femme propriétaire during this period, and the concierge and the tenants, and it's quite interesting. And finally, thanks to his marriage, Vever enters into quite an interesting family that he likes a lot, with many cousins that he becomes friendly with. This is part of Jean Vever's cousins and their families. One of the cousins that he befriends is this man. His name is Jules Écorcheville. He actually was a very famous musicologist, a great Wagnerian who would be killed during World War I, but becomes a very important friend of Vever. And one of these men, I'm sorry, I don't know which right now, is Charles Valadon, who is a banker who becomes very useful to Vever, and Vever invests in his bank as well. So he marries into quite a well-connected family. Thanks to his wife's fortune, Vever now acquires another identity, which is that of a collector, of an art collector. He starts to begin seriously indulging his interest in collecting paintings. He, in fact, as a young man of 20, had begun to collect old Dutch masters, Rembrandt drawings when he had gone on a trip to Amsterdam. And now, after his marriage, he's going to begin to collect paintings. He begins with the École de Barbizon and collects Rousseau, Arpigny, and especially Camille Corot, pour qui, if you could read the tiny quote, I have no idea what happened, Corot pour qui j'ai un vrai culte. Corot, who is in fact his favorite painter. Okay, good. Then he moves on to the Impressionists in the 1880s, and he begins to buy up Impressionist paintings when there's still a relatively good value. Excuse me. Okay. They're still a relatively good value. They haven't hit skyrocket prices yet. So for example, he starts to buy paintings by Monet, and this is a painting that he bought from the dealer Paul Durand-Ruel for 8,000 francs in 1893. It's today in the Art Institute of Chicago. And it depicts Sainte-Adresse, where the Vever family had a home. This is a hole in my research. I'd like to know more about this property. I don't. It belonged to the Vever family itself. It depicts a place where they had a property. Vever is also collecting other painters associated with the Impressionists, Eugène Boudin avec ses pastels délicieux, Albert Le Boer, who he knows, he goes to visit him in his studio. And what's quite interesting too is that of course Vever in Noyer is living in Impressionist country. He's living in the Vallée de la Seine. He rides his bike in Giverny, and guess who he sees? And there is Monet, as he writes, l'illustre Monet dans son jardin entouré de ses fleurs. And so the diary actually gives a very interesting parallel view of the area of the Impressionists from the point of view of someone who was a collector and a resident of this region, and also a painter as well. Vever was not equally keen on all the Impressionists, as he writes. Renoir certainement, c'était pas le peintre de mes rêves, although he did collect him. Ditto for Degas. A fat woman in a tub by Degas. How ugly. I wonder how much it will sell for. Very typical of Vever, very concerned with the prices of the artworks that he is buying. To tell you just a little bit more about his tastes, he likes very much printmakers who are influenced by Japanese printmaking, and we'll soon see why this is important, including Aubrey Beardsley, the English artist who dies in 1898, and Vever writes about his death in his journal, including Henri Vever, printmaker associated with Montmartre cabarets and the Chat Noir. And Vever goes to see this series of prints called Aspect de la Nature in 1898. Vever likes also other painters who are kind of in the vogue of Japonisme, including Alfred Stevens, the Belgian society painter. And of course, he loves Puvis de Chavannes, the great muralist and co-founder of the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts, who also dies in 1898, and Vever writes about him very praisefully in his diary. In the end, though, I'd have to say that Vever's tastes as an art collector are somewhat conservative and certainly eclectic, and he was actually criticized by some critics for the eclecticism of his taste. He wants nothing to do with the Nabi, for example. He goes to see an exhibit and says this is une exposition de gens malades, you know, who would paint a spider with a smile on it this way. He felt similarly about the notorious Balzac statue by Rodin that he goes to see in 1898 that was very controversial and notorious, and writes about it, complètement raté, c'est insensé, fou. And this is very typical of his very emphatic style in his diaries, with lots of exclamations and a lot of energy behind his judgments. So all this to say that these diaries are very interesting on Vever as an art collector. We learn about his tastes, and we also learn a lot about the art market during this period. We learn not only about the most prominent dealers like Durand-Ruel, Georges Petit, and Alphonse Portier, but we also learn about collectors that Vever frequented, like Isaac de Camondo, Charles Efroussi, and other important collectors of this period. We learn about museums and patronage. We learn about critics. We learn about sales at l'Hôtel Drouot. We learn about auctions. We learn about the market. And all of this is really quite interesting. And Vever writes about the art market of his time quite astutely as both a collector and an art lover. So in 1897, Vever sold his painting collection at auction at Georges Petit to finance his new passion. Which would be that of a japonisant, his new passion for Japanese art and art objects. And he therefore is one of the most prominent members of a kind of second or third generation of Japanese art collectors who become enthralled with the decorative arts of Japan following the opening of Japan to commerce with the West in the mid-19th century. And Edmond Goncourt will write in his journal that Vever is le plus passionné de tous les collectionneurs in this world of Japonisants. Like many collectors of this period, he begins by collecting prints, Japanese woodblock prints, namely of the Edo period. And he collects, for instance, what is considered a very rare and very superb print by Kiyonaga, the bathhouse, the only other copy of which was owned by Edgar Degas, who of course was a great amateur of Japanese art as well. And this is Vever's copy that is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. He also collects erotic prints, the shunga prints, which many collectors of his day were favoring. And you have to remember this is a very male world, and that objects such as these were often circulated among men for their interest, but perhaps also for their titillation. But unlike other generations of collectors, Vever is collecting new types of objects as well, not just prints, but netsuke, saber guards, as you see here. As the market for Japanese art objects was expanding, collectors were beginning to collect not just prints, but other types of objects as well. And again, as with Impressionism, from the diaries, we learn a tremendous amount about the market for Japanese art objects during this period of au japonisme. Vever frequents the most important dealers in Japanese objets d'art of this period, namely Tadamasa Hayashi, who would become the Japanese commissioner to the 1900 World's Fair. Also Siegfried Bing, the great impresario, not only of Japanese art, but of Art Nouveau as well. And there is a tremendous amount in the diaries on Bing. Also some newer dealers, some newer kids on the block, including Florine Longuevay, who was a woman, a refugee like Vever from Alsace-Lorraine, who had come to Paris and inherited an antique store from her husband and became very knowledgeable about Japanese art. And collectors like Vever often went to her shop because they felt that her prices were more reasonable than with Hayashi or Bing. So we learn about Madame Longuevay from the diaries. So even in this period, 1898, Vever begins to lend certain objects from his collection to exhibits, an exhibit of Japanese prints at the École des Beaux-Arts, an exhibit that is organized by Bing. He also donates some of his prints to the Louvre. And he does this in part, as he makes clear in the diaries, for sort of patriotic reasons. This is an era, the Louvre has just opened up its Asian wing. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts is accruing a large Asian collection during this period, as are museums in Germany. And as Vever will write in his diaries, he wants to prevent these objects, as he writes, from prendre le chemin d'Amérique. He wants them to stay in France. He is patriotic. He's very interested in a cultural policy that will help boost French cultural patrimony, and he begins to become very involved in a program of giving and lending, the goal of which is to boost French collections. He also says that he does not want these objects to return to Japan. He wants them to remain in France, and he writes quite a bit about this as well. And finally, regarding Japonisme, he becomes part of an inner circle that frequent the monthly dîners japonais. These were monthly dinners organized by Siegfried Bing at chic restaurants around Paris, where amateurs would come together and discuss their latest finds and pass around their latest objects, and also discuss aspects of Japanese culture that interested them. In the diary, there's a very long discussion of harakiri, for example. I mean, this is sort of Japan viewed through a Western lens with a real interest in kind of macabre aspects of Japanese culture. This is a guest list that's in the Vever papers from 1893, from one of the first dîners japonais that Vever attended. And you can see that he was in the very good company of Edmond de Goncourt, of Georges Clemenceau, the future prime minister, who was also a Japonisant, of Claude Monet. And I believe that one of your relatives was there as well, on the other side of the menu. I can show it to you, of the Avillon porcelain manufacturer in Limoges. And my final point on Japonisme is that Vever will spend much time in his activities as a Japonisant with this man, who's another major character in the diary. His name is Charles Gillot. He's a very interesting person that people need to know more about. He was a printer. He was a fine printer, and he was also a collector of Japanese art objects and also medieval objects, as you can see in his decor. And he was a very great influence on Vever in terms of his ideas about design and decoration. And Vever referred to him as the eternal friend, l'ami éternel. And I'll talk a bit more about Gillot in a few minutes. But I'll use Gillot, finally, to pivot to Vever's primary professional identity, which is, of course, as a luxury jeweler, as a leader of the jewelry industry. He was very involved in the union and the chambre syndicale of the employers of the jewelry industry, and as a promoter of Art Nouveau. And of course, we learn much in the diaries about Vever the jeweler. I will pick just 2 points to talk about briefly, because there's so much I could say. So my first point is what I would say, faire quelque chose de nouveau, make it new. As a kind of driving idea for Vever in the last years of the century. So, like many luxury craftspeople of his era, Vever was concerned with elevating the decorative arts to the status of the fine arts and legitimating the decorative arts as art. And in innovating, in creating novel designs, and creating pieces that would have a new look. And many of the pieces I'll show you are in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which received a major donation of Vever pieces. The 1898 diary begins January 1st, 1898, with a very dramatic scene. If I ever make a film about this, I will begin with this scene where Vever has just learned that he's going to be promoted Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. After the Exposition de Bruxelles in 1897, at which the Maison Vever has won a Grand Prix for very beautiful pieces that already are kind of looking forward to Art Nouveau. 4 years before that, in 1893, Vever had been in Chicago at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, and he had stayed in America after that, where he met Tiffany, and he met other designers who were also interested in creating something new. So already in the early 1890s, Vever is thinking about innovating. So he's interested, I won't read this, but I'll talk a bit. He's interested in what he calls le moderne style, what he calls Art Nouveau, or what he calls a style nouveau. And this is very clear in many of his many passages in the diaries that read like manifestos. They're like manifestos in favor of Art Nouveau. This is one of them which I've translated. I'll simply summarize it in a few brief points. He writes in French, I am convinced que nous sommes à une époque très rare, j'allais dire unique, pour la production d'œuvres d'art nouveau. And so he also says in this passage, what he is reacting against, Louis XV, historical styles. What he is promoting, and he summarizes it with the names of some of the famous Art Nouveau creators of his day, Lalique, Tiffany, Grasset, Chéret, Liberty of London. And he also, third point, makes it very clear that 1900 is the horizon. 1900 and the World's Fair of 1900 is going to be the proving ground for Art Nouveau. And the 1900 World's Fair is the subject, the main subject of the fourth of his diaries. So in order to make it new, Vever is looking for new sources of inspiration One of them, as we've seen, is Japan. Part of the interest in Japan, or of a certain Western view of Japan, is as a new source of iconography for his jewelry pieces, as you see here in a few of the pieces. Making it new is also about finding new designers for his pieces. Many of the pieces produced by the Maison Vever were designed by other designers. So we see him looking for other designers. And one of the artists he approaches is Alphonse Mucha, the great Czech graphic artist. Mucha, who designs this poster for a banquet that Vever attends, actually, in honor of Maurice Montier. But as we learn in the diary, this collaboration does not work out, and Mucha will wind up excuse me, designing pieces for the jeweler Fouquet, some of which are worn by Sarah Bernhardt. Vever will turn to another artist who is Eugène Grasset, and we learn quite a bit about this in the diaries. This collaboration is starting to germinate in 1898 and will become much clearer in 1899 and 1900. Grasset is a Swiss graphic artist, very talented, very prolific, and very versatile, who designed the furniture for the home of Charles Gillot that you can see in a room at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. The same Gillot who had un goût exquis, according to Vever. Vever greatly admired Gillot's taste. This same Grasset who designed posters that Vever bought. We find him going to the poster merchant Sagot and buying this, which was called Les Mois, and he goes to a binder and has it bound. This same Grasset who designs a bibliophilic treasure of the fin-de-siècle, which is this book called Histoire des quatre fils Aymon, which is a medieval chanson de geste updated with beautiful illustrations by Grasset, printed by none other than Gillot, the printer, very difficult book to print, and for which Vever created a cover encrusted with jewels. So we learn a lot about this actual interesting collaboration among Vever, Gillot, and Grasset. This will then lead eventually to a collaboration between Vever and Grasset. Of course, Vever is producing much other jewelry as well, and I don't have time to talk about that in detail. But the kind of crown jewel will be a series of pieces that were designed by Grasset and produced by the Maison Vever for the 1900 World's Fair, and will be very controversial and will wind up helping the Maison Vever win a third Grand Prix at the 1900 World's Fair. I'm afraid I'm just going to have time to show you some of these pieces and what making it new looked like in terms of this series of objects. But from the diaries, we learn something about the history of the making of these individual pieces, which is very interesting, and how it was a collaboration not only with Grasset, but also, of course, with lapidaries, with enamelers, with engravers, with photographers, and a whole team of artisans that collaborated on making these pieces, including the Marguerite Proche, the pavot belt buckle in this style that's sometimes described as Merovingian. Grasset had sort of influences from the Middle Ages and from all periods. This omphale necklace, this enormous necklace, which, as Vever writes, came out fairly well, but he worries that it will be nearly impossible to sell because it's about this big, and really points to the multiple ways in which he's conceiving jewelry during this period. And as many Art Nouveau creators were conceiving their objects at once as utilitarian objects that were meant to beautify daily life, but also as art that was museum worthy, and they hoped that museums would buy some of these pieces, as they indeed did, and finally as merchandise that was meant to sell. And so the concern with selling these objects is always present with Vever. And finally, a final Grasset-Vever collaboration, this gorgeous, I love this, sorcière pendant, again kind of Merovingian looking, that was recently bought by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, which has an incredible collection of Art Nouveau. My other takeaway regarding the jewelry business had to do with clients, because unless I don't know something, the business records of the Maison Vever do not exist anymore. I would love to find them if they do. But we do learn a bit about his clientele from the diaries. We know that it included wealthy bourgeois, aristocratic, imperial, and royal clients, including members of the Russian imperial court, members of the Japanese imperial court that are becoming very westernized. Vever talks in the diary about preparing 2 huge corbeilles de mariage for 50,000 francs each for 2 Japanese princes. Members of the American aristocracy, I would say, namely the robber barons of the Gilded Age, including Henry Havemeyer, the great American sugar refinery merchant, and Jephthah Homer Wade of Cleveland, to whom Vever sold pieces at the Chicago World's Fair. Vever both interested in cultivating this wealthy American clientele and very dismissive of what he calls these marchands de cochons de Chicago, of these American swine merchants of Chicago who would become fabulously rich on their family fortunes. And just say a final word in a final section, very, very quickly, about Vever's identity as a private individual, as a family man. He writes quite a bit about his private life, and this is a document of private life as well, and it's very difficult to know about private life, so this is an extremely valuable document from that point of view. A doting father and uncle who had the practice of sketching each of his nieces and nephews and his daughter several hours after birth. I'm indebted to the Vever family for sending me an image of one of their descendants that he sketched. And my great research scoop is that the sketch of Marguerite Vever was found in a bin at the Puce by someone I know. So I'm looking for the other sketches too, if anyone knows where they are. Paul Vever and his, at that point, 5 children. There was to be another child, another daughter. And the son, René, as Vever recounts at length in his diaries, dies very tragically of typhus at age 9. And this is something that is quite painful to read about. Vever was a Parisian man about town who loved and consumed the variety of Parisian leisure activities, whether it be restaurants. He went to the Taverne Poussée, which had a beautiful Art Nouveau interior with paintings by Clairin inside. He enjoyed a meal there. He went to the opera. He went to concerts. He went to the Café des Ambassadeurs and heard Yvette Gilbert, the great chanteuse, sing. He writes about this. He went to the Théâtre Marigny on the Champs-Élysées, which he describes as kind of an updated Folie Bergère, and enjoys an evening there. He goes to see a famous dompteur, an animal tamer named Bidel, who was a great attraction in Paris, and enjoys an evening there. He, like many educated Parisians, is following the news closely. He's a reader of Le Figaro. And of course, in 1898, this means L'Affaire Dreyfus. This will be my last slide. He rides his bicycle because he was a terrific bicycle enthusiast and bicycle race follower, and cycling and the new sport of cycling, La Petite Reine, which was a new invention during this period, is really a character in the diary. So very excited he is about cycling. And I will just offer a quote to you in closing, which I find, ça m'interpelle, and I have to go here to write it, where he writes, he's riding around Noyer on le 14 juillet, and writes, ce trajet est ravissant, c'est un de ceux que j'affectionne, il y a des paysages nouveaux à chaque tournant de route. And in reading this, I really like to think this idea of paysage nouveau à chaque tournant de route, whether real or metaphorical, whether physical, whether geographical, aesthetic, technological, professional, personal, is really the trait marquant, is really the trait that marks this very, very fascinating witness of Parisian life at the dawn of the 20th century. So, merci. I'm not convinced there were other diaries. I am not. I think this is a very, what's the word? It's kind of a whole, and it's very much centered around the World's Fair of 1900. I think that they're diaries that he wrote partly in view of the fair, partly to keep track of his activities leading up to the fair, including his deliberations about should we move to a bigger space, what kind of velour should we have in our exhibit. And I really see 1900 as an endpoint, and he says as much in the diary. He talks about le soleil qui couche and c'est la fin, and it really is an end. In fact, he goes a bit into 1901, but my working hypothesis is that there are not other diaries. Well, there's the one for 1878, as I mentioned, which not that I know of. I certainly would like to know if anyone does, but in reading the ones from 1898 to 1901, it's clear that they're serving a purpose in terms of his preparation for the Exposition Universelle. People can write diaries for many reasons, but one of the reasons he did is for deliberative reasons. He's deliberating about what should we do? Should we move to a bigger space in the Rue de la Paix? And I think once that purpose had been filled, there was really no need to write the diaries anymore. That's my thinking about it. I'd love to know. I don't know if you would know any more about that. Yeah, unless for some reason his grandson who leagued the diaries decided to hold back with other diaries. But yeah. My working hypothesis is that there are not any others. Yeah, but I'd be the first to want to know. Yeah. I mean, of course, the editing is very difficult. The editorial process is very difficult. I never have done editing like this. I seem to have a knack for undertaking very difficult projects. My first book was a biography. When my thesis director said, write a biography, and I said, sure. I had no idea, and I wound up writing a biography. I don't really have quibbles with him and the way he reconstructs reality, except when I find there were certain words I couldn't read, for example. He's a great mondain. The index of my book is maybe 30 pages. There are that many people mentioned in it. So a challenge is to find out who all these people are, not just well-known people, but people in the, his friends and milieu and people working in his jewelry house. And then questions of who should I identify. And then, of course, I'm an American writing in French for a French audience, a primarily French audience. So this was a very great test of my own culture générale and my own knowledge of French culture to figure out, am I going to need to identify this opera by Massenet, maybe French people might know this opera, but maybe not that opera. So the kind of cultural translation aspects of my editing were difficult for me. But I don't have really qualms with the way he wrote. That's part of the reason I wanted to publish the diary rather than write a monograph. I think it's so engaging that it stands as it is. And that's the reason why I wanted to publish it as an édition intégrale also. I briefly contemplated cutting the parts about the chambre syndicale. He's often at his chambre syndicale, at his union, with the other patrons of other industries. And they're talking about the orphanage or the bal or whatever. But it's really quite interesting, and for anyone who wants to know how an industry works, it's all of a piece. So I think that, I'll see what the readers think, but I think there's a merit to including as much as I could. But thanks for asking about the process. Yes, difficult. Yeah. He's following it every day. He's reading the special editions of the Figaro. He's reading them in the train. He's tearing his hair out because there's so much information. We understand what it is to have a glut of information because the people in the late 19th century were experiencing that too. So, as we know, the historiography of the affair tells us that with J'accuse, the French were divided into two camps, Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. I mean, this is kind of part of the mythology about the affair, which is largely true, but on the borders, there are people who are evolving and learning and changing positions, and Vever is one of these people who, when J'accuse comes out, He's talking about, I quote, Zola vomit des matières fécales. This is what Vever says. But then is reading, and we have, Henri's suicide, and we have revelation of some of the documents that pointed to Dreyfus's innocence. And Vever is talking with his friends, and little by little, by the fall, he is a partisan de la révision, and he writes on a certain date, he writes, "Et si Dreyfus n'était pas coupable, quelle effroyable chose." So he writes to himself, really, what if this guy really is innocent? This would be horrible if we really did convict innocent.
Exactly what
She does, but no, she says that because I read it recently, but she said, "Ça ne peut pas être possible." That's the next line. Yes. So really, they have very different positions. There is some mild anti-Semitism, I would say, in Vever's diaries. He talks about the venimeuses insinuations des Juifs. But it has nothing to do with the extremism of Drummond or of some of the others. I consider it very banal in the context of the period. It is certainly nothing that he acts on. He has many Jewish friends in his milieu, collectors, many very close friends as well. But it is interesting to see that there are very common social attitudes that pervade large sections of French society during this time, which some people act on and some don't, and he certainly does not. No, but he remarks the presence of Jews. I mean, just like Proust does when Swann enters a salon. Vever writes, we went to this place and there were some bonnes têtes israélites or something like that. And it's a notable moment when Jews are becoming very assimilated in French society, but at the same time, the more invisible they become, the prejudice is also. But that I don't consider prejudice, but it's a notable fact in his milieu.
Did he know Zola?
No, not personally. No, he didn't. Yeah, he just railed against him after J'accuse. I wrote an article on the Dreyfus Affair in Vever's diaries. If anyone's interested, I'd be happy to share it. I'll just make the last point. He wants the affair to end. He wants it to end. He's from Lorraine. He wants it to end so France can get back to regaining Alsace-Lorraine. He wants it to end so that people will not be striking in the Place de la Concorde, right near the Rue de la Paix, where his shop is. He wants it to end. He's very clear about this because he's afraid that foreigners are going to stay home and not come to Paris in 1900 and buy his stuff. He talks about this. And he's also, finally, a Republican notable. I mean, it may be sort of this fantasy idea, to become mayor of this commune, but once he has a kind of investment in La République au village and comes around to kind of a centrist Republican position of being in favor of the revision. So once you start examining microhistory like this, things get quite interesting.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.